For any of you who don't know me, I'm Barbara Gross, and I'm representing the Lifelong Learning Committee today. And I'm really delighted to welcome everyone on this Zoom call, especially our Rabbi Emeritus, Stu Gershon. We're so happy to have you here with us today. Before we begin, just a few little announcements. First of all, thank you, Michal, for managing the Zoom for us today. We really appreciate you. Thank you, Sandy Schlanger, for developing the idea for this program and for working with Rabbi Gershon, the committee, and the temple staff to be sure it all came together so well. And thank you, Lenore Lerner, if you're here, and the DEI committee for setting up our wonderful three-part series on racism. The talk today is the second part, and I want to remind everyone to join us on Sunday, February 13th. At 11:30 a.m. to learn with Dr. Karen Gaffney, author of Dismantling the Racism Machine. And the program, the workshop will be about the myths surrounding racism. The link to register for that program is on the temple website and in Kol Sinai. And maybe we could even put it into the chat today for anyone who doesn't have access to those two things. Please spread the word, invite your friends, invite your colleagues. The program promises to be the perfect prelude to the Super Bowl. One more quick bit of housekeeping. Please keep yourself on mute during Rabbi Gershon's talk, except when he wants us to unmute to comment or ask questions. Okay, so Michal has just put in the link in the chat that link for Karen Gaffney is the same link as this one. Rabbi Gershon, we're so happy you're here. We're all looking forward to an exciting, challenging afternoon of learning with you. We're all yours.
Stu, unmute. You're muted, Stu.
Stu, you're muted. Stu, you're muted.
Yep, got it.
Okay.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay, great. Well, hello, Temple Sinai. What a pleasure to see you again. I hope everyone is well. I want to wish everyone a very happy secular New Year. And thank you all so much for joining me this afternoon. Thank you, Barbara, for that lovely and warm welcome. Thanks also to you, Barbara, and Sandy Schlanger, for your help in choosing the topic, getting this program on the calendar. My thanks and appreciation to the Lifelong Committee for the invitation to make this presentation. Last but not least, thank you, Saskia and Michal, for helping me out as administrators. And to everybody, thank you again for joining me today. Our subject is the impact of hate, racist ideologies in Nazi Germany and Jim Crow America in the 1930s. It is, of course, a very serious and sobering topic. And I'm excited to share the fruits of my research with you. I've been studying this subject, I guess now, for about 2 years. But as I said a moment ago, this is not a lecture. This is not a one-way dialogue. I look forward to hearing your questions and even more hearing your comments. So as you might imagine, there is so much to discuss. So here is today's roadmap. And I'm going to ask Saskia, Michal to start screen sharing now. Okay, so there is so much to discuss. So here is our roadmap for today. And by the end of this program, it is my hope for the following. Number one, we will possess a deeper and yes, more frightening understanding of the doctrines, dogmas, and obsessions of racist ideologies. We will see how dark they really are and therefore how dangerous they are to every minority and all marginalized peoples. We will understand the historical context that produced the Nuremberg race laws, become familiar with some of the actual text of the Nuremberg race laws, and understand the significance of what they say. We will also gain a deeper and, yes, more sobering knowledge of the points of contact between the Nuremberg race laws and American race law. Then we will discuss the question of whether or not American racial policies more broadly influenced Hitler and the Nazi leadership. Finally, we will discuss how Hitler and the Nazi regime perceived the United States of America. Let's turn to the next slide. Okay. I want to say a word about why I prefer to use the term racist ideologies rather than racism. Racism is more than a set of beliefs or attitudes about race. Racism comes with a set of doctrines and dogmas about race. And racist ideologies put these doctrines and dogmas into practice, into policies, into law, into a plan of action. It is out of racist ideologies that racist regimes, or if you prefer, caste systems like those of Nazi Germany and Jim Crow America are born. So let's take a minute to comprehend the hateful impact of these two racist ideologies. Of course, as Jews, we are painfully aware of the horrific consequences of Nazi hate, embracing every classic anti-Semitic trope to justify its hatred. The ideology of Nazi racism demanded brutal violence, exclusion and humiliation, economic impoverishment and ghettoization of Jews. In 1933, the Nazi leadership's original solution to the Jewish question was to separate Germans from Jews by forcibly compelling all Jews to leave Germany. But few countries, and I'm not sure if everyone knows that annihilation was not their original intent. But few countries were willing to accept Jewish refugees, and Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939 brought 3.3 million Polish Jews under Nazi control. By mid-1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22nd, the decision to mass murder Jews had likely already been made, beginning with the massacre of Soviet Jews through mobile SS killing squads. By the fall of 1941, Nazi planners began to construct the first death camps in Poland. The final solution of the Jewish question had begun. So what are the consequences of Nazi racist ideology? The ideology of Nazi racism drove the persecution of Jews to the point of genocide, the mass murder of 6 million Jews. Nazi racist ideology pursued the most extreme racist objective possible: to murder every single Jew in Europe. Next slide. Now let's understand the horrid consequences of Jim Crow hatred. Adopting every anti-Semitic, anti-Black stereotype and caricature to reinforce its animosity, the ideology of Jim Crow racism mandated the brutalization, segregation, the repression, and subordination of Black people. The ideology of Jim Crow racism directly led to the murder of at least 4,732 Black Americans by some form of white violence, in addition to at least another 4,400 deaths by lynching. These are documented statistics. In Caste and Class in a Southern town, sociologist John Darnold wrote, "Every Negro in the South knows that he is under a kind of sentence of death. He does not know when his turn will come. It may never come, but it may also be at any time." In the late 19th, early 20th century, Jim Crow racism unleashed a reign of sadistic terror on the Black population of the United States through public lynching, race riots, mob massacres, and executions by torture. Long after slavery's abolition, the objective of Jim Crow racist ideology was to reimpose upon Black Americans modern slavery-like conditions of oppression, unfreedom, and cruel treatment. The terrible consequences of Jim Crow racism and Nazi racism compel us to better understand the doctrines, dogmas, creeds, obsessions, preoccupations, and imperatives that underpinned the ideologies of Nazi racism and Jim Crow racism. So this afternoon, I want to unpack 4 racial doctrines that I believe are the most crucial for us to understand. In Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, these doctrines are termed the pillars of caste systems. And so we come to the first racial doctrine. The first racial doctrine shared by the ideologies of Nazi racism and Jim Crow racism, equivalent to Wilkerson's pillar number 8, is that human beings are not equal, not equal. This is so hard for us to understand because we are so brought up in the notion of human equality, right? The inalienable, unalienable rights of all human beings, that all men are created equal, etc. Racist ideology denies that truth. It says the real truth is that a hierarchy of human inequality exists, determined by the laws of nature. The truth is that there is one master race endowed with the most superior qualities, and it stands above all others. By virtue of its superiority, this first racial doctrine adds, the master race possesses the right to dominate all other innately inferior races and considers itself entitled to rights and privileges that the inferior races are not. The place of the doctrine of human inequality within the ideology of Nazi racism was made perfectly clear by Adolf Hitler. And I would like, rather than me, I would like it if someone would be willing to read these quotes from Hitler in English. Could I get a volunteer? Anybody? Or
I'll
maybe,
volunteer, Rabbi.
okay, thank you, Beverly.
Okay. We cannot admit that one race is equal to another. By recognizing that they are different, the Völkisch national race community separates mankind into races of superior and inferior quality in conformity with the eternal will that dominates the universe, to postulate the victory of the better and stronger and the subordination of the inferior and weaker. Do you want me to read the second one?
Please, you're doing such a great job. Please
Okay.
continue.
All the human culture, all the results of art, science, and technology that we see before us today are almost exclusively the creative product of the Aryan. He alone was the founder of all higher humanity. He is the Prometheus of mankind. The mightiest counterpart to the Aryan is represented by the Jew. The Jew is a parasite in the body of other nations and states.
Thank you, Beverly. Okay, so let's keep that slide there. Now, I think some of us are familiar with some of this because as we know, Nazi racist ideology insisted that the Aryan race, what we would now call white Northern Europeans, this is important, was the most superior race on earth. As the inheritors of all the Aryans' mental and physical gifts, Aryan Germans constituted the master race. Nazi racism viewed all non-Northern European peoples, of course Jews, but also Poles, Slavic peoples, the Roma and Sinti, Russians of Asian descent, and Blacks as racially inferior. The doctrine of human inequality is also reflected in the ideology of Jim Crow racism. And with that, we move to the next slide. And could I get another volunteer to read this?
I
This is,
will.
okay, thank you.
The supremacy of the white race of the South must be maintained forever, and the domination of the Negro race resisted at all points and at all hazards, because the white race is the superior race. This is the declaration of no new truth. It has abided forever in the marrow of our bones and shall forever with the blood that feeds Anglo-Saxon hearts.
Thank you, Lynn. So Jim Crow racism claimed that the most pure, proud, noble race that ever walked the earth was the Anglo-Saxon, and I would also add Protestant race. As descendants of Anglo-Saxon ancestry, white Americans were the master race. Having inherited all the superior Anglo-Saxon genetic traits, Jim Crow racism viewed all other non-Anglo-Saxon peoples, Blacks, Asians, Natives, Americans, and Hispanics, as racially inferior. Now, before moving on, I just want to point out that it is so interesting that both Jim Crow racism and Nazi racism claim white Northern European ancestry. Whether you call it Arctic or Nordic or Anglo-Saxon, it's different terms for the very same thing as their story of national origin. Okay, let's go on. Okay, a second racial doctrine. I view this not only as a doctrine, but I view it as an obsession of both Jim Crow racist ideology and Nazi racist ideology, was the absolute necessity to safeguard the racial purity of the master race. This second racial doctrine is equivalent to Wilkerson's pillar number 4. Any interracial race mixing would contaminate the purity of the master race and diminish its innate superiority. And this is the issue. If the purity of the master race is contaminated, that means its innate superiority is reduced. And so I want to make a very important point here, which I think is very hard for us to get our minds around, but is so crucially important. The inferior race is the racial enemy of the master race, not just a political enemy, we'll get to that, but a racial enemy. By its very existence, the inferior race is a threat to the continued survival of the master race. Very hard for us to get our minds around, but this is a core aspect of racial ideology. In order to protect the racial purity of the master race, both Nazi racism and Jim Crow racism prohibited interracial marriage. But neither stopped there. The obsession of both ideologies with racial purification led to further racist extremes. And we need to understand that those extremes were caused by these beliefs in racial purity. Jim Crow racism imposed severe racial segregation, terrorized the Black population to enforce sexual separation, and determined that even one drop of blood, of Black blood, confirmed Black identity, declaring that the purity of German blood is the prerequisite for the continued existence of the German Volk, which I would translate as the national race community. Nazi racism moved to exclude Jews from all areas of public life, and then followed with the ultimate terrors of ghettoization, deportation, and elimination. So we all see the racist extreme here, but it must be pointed out that the very first victims of Nazi mass murder were Germany's own disabled population. I'm not sure how many of us know this. It's critically important. In the name of racial purity, Nazi racism targeted the physically and mentally disabled. 400,000 Germans were forcibly sterilized. And when the Nazi regime deemed the disabled to be unworthy of life, 300,000 German infants, children, and adults were killed. Next slide. A third racial doctrine shared by Jim Crow racism and Nazi racism is the accusation that the hated race is not really human. And this is equivalent to Wilkerson's pillar number 6. Dehumanization served a threefold purpose: to justify the regime's inhumane treatment, to win the acquiescence of the public, and to soothe the guilty conscience of perpetrators. Nazi racism maligned Jews as parasites, lice, vermin. It's important for us to see the imagery. The imagery is one of biology, biological imagery, bacteriological imagery. And I think we see where this goes, because that means that gassing or shooting Jews to death amounted to nothing more than killing rodents. Jim Crow racism denigrated Blacks as dumb animals, beasts of burden. Since Black lives were worthless, nothing was wrong with murdering them. Next slide, please. Okay. The fourth racial doctrine, and this is the final one, because I know we can't take more, that is common to racist ideology, Nazi racist ideology, and Jim Crow racist ideology, was the allegation that the despised race, despite its supposed inferiority, was the arch enemy of the master race and needed to be killed. So in addition now to the racial enemy, that the inferior race is a racial enemy, the inferior race is now also the political archenemy. In the 1930s, anti-Jewish conspiracy theories were rampant in Germany. Jews were traitors, somehow responsible for Germany's defeat in World War I and its post-war humiliation. And this belief spread even though 100,000 German Jews fought in the First World War for Germany. Jews were the agents of the anti-German Bolshevik Revolution. Jews secretly conspired to dominate Germany and rule the world. Fueled by Nazi propaganda, all these anti-German conspiracies masterminded by Jews, falsely transformed Jews into Germany's greatest political enemy, an enemy from within. So too, in the 1930s, it was commonly feared that the Black population, despite its oppressed situation in America in the 1930s, was somehow going to rise up, rebel, and take over America. These fears were fueled by the racist theories of the American eugenics movement. And we're going to come back to the American eugenics movement several times today. That movement did a lot of harm and hurt. In The Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald referenced a racist eugenic theory of white extinction. One character says, the idea is if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged by Blacks. And way back in 1915, President Woodrow Wilson's White House screening of the notorious silent film, Birth of a Nation, had already legitimated and amplified the view that Black people were a dangerous menace to white women. These totally mythic fears transformed Blacks into America's greatest political enemy. Falsely so, of course. Let's skip back. Let's stay on the other slide for 1 second, Michal. Now, I would like to refine my point here. In my view, it is this doctrine, which, by the way, I was unable to find in Wilkerson's cast. It may be there, but I couldn't find it. That is the most crucial of all. Why? For me, it helps to explain the behavior of ordinary Germans who brutally murdered Jews and church-going Christians who lynched Blacks to do the despicable things they did. That is to say, indoctrinated. They were indoctrinated to believe. And this whole issue of indoctrination is so important. But they were indoctrinated to believe, obviously falsely, that Jews on the one hand and Blacks on the other were a savage enemy out to get them. And because of that, they behaved savagely. Those who are accused of being savage are actually, those who accuse others of being savage actually behave savagely. Okay, so that is a lot. Let's go out of the screen for a moment because I want to pause here, take questions, comments, reflections. I know I've thrown a tremendous amount at you, but let's take a minute and see if anyone has any question or comment, reflection, and then we will turn our attention to the Nuremberg laws. Yes, unmute yourself and.
Okay, I'm unmuted. It's Beverly.
Yeah. Yes, Beverly.
How can we make many American Jews realize that they are the same and these extremists in our country as the Blacks are? We're exactly the same. And they don't understand that. I was just talking to my cousin who was very upset that on TV, you see a lot of mixed couples. And I tried to explain to her, well, that's good, because that means it won't be unusual and you'll get used to it and it'll be fine because it's fine with them. It has nothing to do with you. But she doesn't understand that. And her friends don't. Mind you, they're all my age and older, but still, I think middle-aged people feel the same way, middle-aged American Jews.
that the problem that is going on with minorities is not a Jewish problem. Is that that was what you mean?
Yes, they don't understand that it's the same problem, that they are just as targeted, or can be just as, they are just as targeted.
Yes. I think there is a fog of forgetting, a fog of denial in the American Jewish community, that we don't want to see what's really there.
Mhm.
And there have been articles written about this, that the notion of American exceptionalism when it comes to American Jewish life is really a myth. That we've endured lots of anti-Semitism in this country, very vicious anti-Semitism, at times worse here than it was in Europe if you isolate particular eras, which is so key. And I just believe it's very much an issue of denial and of putting blinders on, that we are just too terrified to see it. Okay, other questions? Yes, Barbara. Barbara, I think you're muted.
I just read a book, Rabbi, called The Last Million. I don't know if you've read it yet, but in that book, it's about the last million Jews that were left in Europe after the war and what happened to them. And what you are saying right now is exactly what's in that book, that after the Holocaust and the people were coming out of the camps, American Jews, a lot of them did not support to bring those people to our shores. And it really was not until some very wealthy New Yorkers and Harry Truman worked and worked and worked to get them out of Europe in 1948. So this is something, what Beverly's talking about, is been around for a long time.
Yes. Yes, thank you both for those insights. That is true. American Jewry was very frightened about anti-Semitism, which was very severe in the 1930s, right? If we really look at the sobering facts, it was very severe. And the American Jewry was very concerned about its place in American society if they really pushed hard on saving American Jewry. And there's been many books written about this, and that American Jewry finally did get radicalized, but very late in the process, very late.
Very late.
Okay, all right, let's go on. I see time is moving along, so let's get to the next section. At the very end, for those who are willing to stay, have time to stay, I'll answer any other questions. Okay, all right. Let's go to our next slide. Oh, actually, I think I'm going to, okay. So we now are going to turn our attention to the Nuremberg race laws. Michal, I lied. We're not going to go to this now. Let's just, you know what? Let's just take off screen share for this next section. Okay, because this section, I want to move along quicker, and I think it'll be just helpful to listen to what I'm now about to share. I want to begin, before we get to the laws themselves, when we'll come back to screen sharing, I want to talk about the historical context, the historical forces that produced the Nuremberg race laws. So here we go. Upon taking power, Hitler and the high Nazi leadership moved quickly to transform Germany into a completely racist state. Their objective was to institute a racial political system that was solely organized around the privilege and the protection of the Aryan German race. By the way, that is what we mean by a racist state. Everything is oriented around the privilege and the protection of the master race. In the Nazi racist worldview, the very presence of racial foreigners and their foreign blood on German soil endangered the racial purity and perfection of the Volk. We've heard that before, the Aryan German racial community. Racially foreign elements had to be removed from Germany. As early as 1920, the Nazi Party program, 1920 now, long before Hitler came into power, the Nazi Party program called for the restriction of citizenship to persons of German blood. Why? Prohibiting resident foreigners from citizenship served a twofold purpose. It exposed them to expulsion. If you're not a citizen, we can kick you out, get rid of you, racial foreigner. And while you are still in Germany, before we've kicked you out, it silences your political voice. You have no political influence, no power whatsoever. Soon after taking power, the Nazi regime enacted its first race-based citizenship law, the 1933 law on the revocation of naturalization and withdrawal of German citizenship. This law expelled European Jews, Eastern European Jews, who came to Germany after World War I. Now, by 1934, the Nazi regime had been in power for 18 months. And despite a wave of laws enacted in 1933 that excluded Jews, Nazi radicals were dissatisfied with the pace of anti-Jewish persecution and agitated for more. In 1935, Nazi radicals engaged in widespread street violence that often killed Jews. In particular, they attacked Jews who were engaged in sexual relationships with Germans. Incensed by acts of so-called racial defilement, Nazi radicals were determined to prevent, quote, any further penetration of Jewish blood into the body of the German Volk. To placate the Nazi street radicals and also to assert control over them, the central Nazi leadership declared that harsh anti-Jewish laws were forthcoming, including legislation that would criminalize racial defilement. So, from the agitation of anti-Jewish violence in the street, the Nuremberg race laws were born. 17 high officials and lawyers met on June 5th, 1934, to devise the next steps to legalize Jewish persecution, and to respond to the radicals' demands. Represented at the meeting were both Nazi radicals and, if you can stand the term, Nazi moderates. We know what was said at this meeting because we have a verbatim German stenographic transcript of it. Two controversial issues were to be addressed at the meeting. Now, everyone in attendance expected a new citizenship law to be formulated that would withdraw the citizenship status of all Jews born in Germany, not those who had immigrated or maybe were naturalized. That had already been dealt with. But what about all those German Jews born in Germany who should have the right to citizenship? So everyone knew that such an anti-Jewish law was coming at this meeting. The controversial issue on the table was how to define who was a Jew. In order to withdraw the citizenship status and expel as many Jews as possible, the Nazi radicals pushed for the most far-reaching definition of who is a Jew. They proposed to continue the classification of who is a Jew that was incorporated within that 1933 law on the revocation of naturalization and the withdrawal of German citizenship. That law classified as a Jew any person with even one Jewish parent or grandparent. In other words, if you were even a quarter Jewish, you were classified as a Jew. But the Nazi radicals wanted more. While the Nazi radicals considered citizenship and immigration laws that expelled non-Aryans and stopped non-Aryan immigration into Germany to be important, they were insufficient to achieve the full Nazi racist vision. The Nazi radicals wanted Germany to transform its legal system to include the concept of race crime. That is to declare any action that was deemed to endanger or cause harm to the Aryan German race a criminal offense that resulted in harsh punishment. And this brings us to the second controversial issue of the June 5th meeting. I'll come back to the first. Above all, the Nazi radicals insisted all race mixing between Germans and Jews had to stop. In their racist worldview, the marriage of a German to a non-Aryan was a betrayal of loyalty to the Aryan German race. It was nothing less than an act of race treason, in their words. The Nazi radicals demanded that the Nazi regime make interracial marriage a crime, punishable with imprisonment. Okay, so we have two issues here. Who is a Jew? How is it going to be defined? Citizenship and interracial marriage. Now that we understand the historical forces behind the origin of the Nuremberg race laws, let's delve into the text of those laws and learn how these controversial issues debated at that June meeting were decided. Okay? Okay. Let's go back to our screen. Screen share. On September 15th, 1935, the German parliament, the Reichstag, enacted two laws at the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg. Proclaimed by Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, Nazi Germany's second in command, the Nuremberg race laws consisted of the Reich citizenship law and the law on the protection of German blood and German honor. Here we see the first Nuremberg race law, the Reich citizenship law. Let's read Article 2, number 1. Can I have a volunteer? Anybody? Just that first sentence.
I'll read it. A Reich citizen is a subject of the state who is of German blood or racially related blood.
Thank you. Now, was this law to be expected from the June 5th meeting? Absolutely, yes. The Reich citizenship law stripped all Jews of German citizenship, as we discussed. Overnight, German Jews became subjects of the state, not citizens, therefore unprotected, with few rights and vulnerable to expulsion. Citizenship law is all about being able to get somebody out, to expel somebody. Now let's read Article 2, number 3. Again, if someone would read that.
I can read it. The Reich citizen is the sole bearer of full political rights.
Thank you, Andy. Okay, here too, also as expected, the Reich citizenship law deprived Jews of their voting rights. Full political rights includes voting rights. And so if Jews have no voting rights, it leaves them with no political influence as to what's going on in Germany at all. What is the significance of this first Nuremberg race law, the Reich citizenship law? Now the status of citizenship, including the right to vote, were exclusively determined by race and blood, no longer on the land of one's birth. All rights, privileges, and protections of citizenship belong solely to the Aryan German race. This is what we mean by a racist state. Now, let's turn to the second Nuremberg race law. This law is the law on the protection of German honor and German honor and German blood. I think I have it backwards there. Let's read Article 1, number 1. Again, could I have a volunteer?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Marriages between Jews and citizens of German blood or racially related blood are forbidden. If such marriages are nevertheless entered into, they are null and void, even if they are concluded abroad in order to evade this law.
Thank you. And now, since you're doing so good, could you read Article 2?
Extramarital relations between Jews and citizens of German blood or racially related blood are forbidden.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. Was this law, were Articles 1 and 2 to be expected from the June 5th meeting? Everyone should be thinking yes. The law on the protection of German honor and German blood outlawed all marital and extramarital relationships between Jews and Aryan Germans. I hope everyone sees that, right? So this whole discussion, that's what happened. Now let's read Article 5, number 1.
I'll do that, Rabbi. It's Lenore.
Thank you, Lenore.
Any person who violates the prohibition of Article 1 shall be punished with imprisonment at hard labor.
Okay, and then if you would, Article 5, number 2.
A male who violates the prohibition of Article 2 shall be punished with imprisonment or with imprisonment at hard labor.
Thank you very much, Lenore. So my question, everybody, is, does the second Nuremberg race law reflect the victory of the Nazi radicals? How many of you say yes? Show of hands. Yes, absolutely. They won. All interracial relationships between Jews and Aryan Germans are now a crime, a race crime, a criminal offense punishable with imprisonment. So what is the significance of this law? Now the state determined who you could and could not marry. There was no longer any right to personal freedom. The most important value of the state was the protection of Aryan German racial purity and superiority. To endanger that is a crime against the state. Okay, next slide. Many historians cite the proclamation of the Nuremberg race laws on September 15th, 1935, as the precise moment when Nazi Germany became a fully racist regime. Now we have a better understanding why. On that day, all previous German commitments to the Enlightenment principles of human equality, equal rights, and individual freedoms were revoked. Okay. Let's pause here for a second. I guess, yeah, let's pause here because again, we've just undertaken a lot. Questions, comments?
Rabbi,
Yes.
what do they mean by racially related blood?
Yeah, I was gonna ask that, yeah.
Racially, anything that's a good question. I don't know specifically any other aspect of that makes you Aryan. Any other way that they understood that you're also an Aryan. That's an actually, I don't know the precise answer to that question. Why your question is good. Why do they need to say that? I don't know. I will have to find out. Other questions, comments? Yeah, I see.
Yes, I have a question about how does this relate to disabled? Does that have anything to do with racially related blood or German blood? Is there a priority with the disabled, and what do they determine is disabled?
Okay, that's very, very good. That's a very important question, because now we're getting into the question of your racial enemy is not just a Jew. Your racial enemy of the state is anybody who's also disabled, because you are endangering the purity and the perfection of the gene pool. That's why they started targeting all of the mentally and physically disabled. They are bringing down the racial, the genetic purity of the country. That's the way they saw it, as crazy as it is, as it seems. They had in these laws 8 or 9 categories for what made you disabled, but it included things like if you were born deaf, you might have been killed. If you were born blind, you might have been killed. What we would call today, disabilities that people have to be helped with, they saw as a race imperfection, and they were going to eliminate these people.
So it had nothing to do, it was only if you were born that way. Being injured in World War I would not be in that category.
No, but they had something, they did have you, if you had physical impairments, they would also consider you unworthy of life. If you had mental illnesses, schizophrenia, things like that. They also had a category called feeble-mindedness, which was a catch-all that a lot of people who really wanted to put people to death, they just said, you're feeble-minded, and they were put to death. That's how it worked. But to your point, this is not about race here, right? This is about genetic purity, because these were Aryans. These were fellow Germans. They're Aryan. But that's not good enough. You have to be racially pure Aryan. You have to be perfect Aryan. That's how harsh and vicious it got. Okay, let's go on. Now, there's one controversial issue that we have not covered. Does anyone, I know I've thrown a lot at you. What is the one controversial issue we did not discuss? It's the definition of who is a Jew. The Nuremberg race laws did not directly address the definition of who is a Jew. It's not there. For that definition, we need to look at the first supplementary decree to the Reich citizenship law that was issued 2 months later, November 14th, 1935. Let's read Article 1. Can anyone volunteer for that for me?
I can do it.
Thank you.
Article 1, a Jew is anyone who is descended from at least 3 grandparents who are racially full Jews.
Okay, now, wait 1 second. Is this the classification that the Nazi radicals had wanted? No. Remember, in 1933, there had been a law that defined a Jew, classified anyone as a Jew if you had 1 grandparent. Now it's 3. The post-Nuremberg regulation did not incorporate the most far-reaching definition of a Jew. The regulation stipulated a minimum of at least 3 Jewish grandparents before the hammer could come down on you. The first supplementary decree to the Reich citizenship law actually functioned to shield 1/4 Jews from being classified as Jews. Everybody with me? I know this is not what we are expecting, and this is why it is so important to be brought out. Now, quarter Jews, but what about the Germans who were equally mixed blood, half Jewish and half Aryan German? Were they Aryan German and protected, or were they Jewish and not protected? They would lose their citizenship. Let's read article number 2. Can I have another volunteer?
I would, Pam. A Jew is also one who is descended from 2 full Jewish grandparents. If A, he belongs to the Jewish religious community at the time this law was issued, or joins the community later. B, he was married to a Jewish person at the time the law was issued, or marries one subsequently.
Thank you. This stipulation is big, is hugely important. And what is the most crucial word in article number 2? The word if. In other words, the post-Nuremberg regulation stipulated that half Jews would be counted as Jews if they chose to practice the Jewish religion or marry a Jew. However, half Jews who chose neither of these life choices, no ifs, no ifs. They did not marry a Jew. They did not belong to a synagogue. They were classified as Mischling, a half-blood, meaning they're not an Aryan German, no, but they're not a Jew either. They're not a Jew either. Everybody with me? Here again, the post-Nuremberg regulation did not incorporate the harshest classification sought by the Nazi radicals. What had they wanted? They wanted every half Jew to be classified as a Jew. But this first supplementary decree actually created a new racial category, Mischling, that worked to protect at least some half Jews from being classified as Jews. Everybody with me? Okay. Professor James Whitman, who wrote the book, Hitler's American Model, his interpretation of all this is that the Nazi moderates held off the Nazi radicals on the definition of who is a Jew. The Nazi moderates limited Jewish classification from 1 Jewish grandparent to a minimum of 3, and narrowed the Jewish classification of half Jews from all, every half Jew is a Jew, to some. Why? Why would the Nazi moderates do this? One scholarly explanation is the high rate of German-Jewish intermarriage. In all likelihood, the Nazi moderates were very much aware that many, many Aryan Germans had quarter Jews and half Jews in their families. According to Professors Deborah Dwork and Robert Jan van Pelt, quote, but a lot of good Germans had quarter Jewish or half Jewish kin. 45% of the marriage vows taken by Jews in 1932 had been to non-Jews. In 1933, the figure had risen to 55%. And Whitman agrees. German Jewry had a substantial history of intermarriage, and there was also a heavy proportion of mixed descent persons whose status was uncertain. by the official Nazi reckoning in 1935, there were 550,000 full and three-quarter Jews, 200,000 half Jews, and 100,000 quarter Jews in Germany. The Nazi moderates could do nothing to help the 550,000 full and three-quarter Jews, but they could do something to shield the 200,000 half Jews and 100,000 quarter Jews. Okay. All right. Let's pause for a minute. Moving right along. Comments, questions?
Rabbi, there's usually some reason. I mean, they just don't go out of their way to treat the Jews well.
Right.
And clearly there were a lot of them, but I'm thinking there must have been some hidden motivation under there for them to be so kind to us.
Yes, it's quite strange to be talking about any Nazi as a moderate, right? It's like a very, what are we talking about? But in fact, there were some, to some extent, they all wanted a Nazi racial state, but there's also issues of protection. And it could have been in their own families that they had some of these quarter Jews and half Jews, or they knew people. And so they wanted to protect them. This actually also relates to the whole problem, to the whole issue of the one drop rule, that even one drop of black blood made you black. In fact, before the 20th century, many states refused to adopt the one drop rule. And the reason why is that white legislators recognized the adverse impact on other white families, because there'd be generations of interracial marriage. And they realized if you really accepted the one drop rule, you would really turn the life of people who deemed themselves, who thought themselves as white all their lives, you would turn their lives around. They would now be black. And now liable to all this discrimination. So this is an important feature, that when people make these laws, there are very, fiercely virulent people, and there's also people who recognize, what is second, this is going to hurt us somehow. This is going to hurt us, people we know somehow.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So given that a certain number of people, a large number of people, had the experience of realizing that they were vulnerable, they had, some fraction of Jewish blood in their heritage.
Mhm.
So they knew then at that point, feeling that this was wrong. This was, they were experiencing, this is who I am. I've got this portion of this fraction of Jewish blood. Does that make me worthy of this terrible treatment? They knew that was wrong, that those people. Why did they not then, why did they modify? Why did they not then assert that knowledge?
The Nazi moderates?
Yes.
There was only so much they could do. I mean, they were also racist. They were racist. They really wanted to create a racist state where Aryan Germans, everything is about Aryan German.
But that involved ruling themselves out, because they had that in them.
Power.
Yeah, well, maybe they were also in some denial too. But, it's a very good question. I think some, the most virulent Aryan Germans never thought that there could be any German blood within them, right? I think we have some, I just remember reading something about this. They're either in denial about it, they won't admit it, that kind of thing. Because the supremacy of the Aryan race, the master race, and the continued supremacy is key. That's what everything is about. Maintaining the supremacy of the master race.
I got a question. Once these Nuremberg laws were passed, I guess it was generally known, was there allowed for these people to get out of Germany, to leave, or were they not allowed to emigrate?
The whole issue of the Mischling, very good question. The whole issue of the Mischlings, I have not looked into in depth because it wasn't that they weren't they were discriminated against to some extent. But I don't know all the specifics. In terms of getting out, as time went on, no Jews could get out. And also what happened is that, with all these laws, people tragically get caught up, right? I mean, there were Jews who had no connection to the Jewish community that somehow would still get caught up in this and be classified as a Jew. And the whole thing was incredibly frightening and tragic. Okay, let's move on. We have to get to two more important issues, and then we'll call it a day. Now that we have studied the Nuremberg race laws, what they say, and the context in which they were produced, we can evaluate the historical connections between these laws and American race law. In other words, the question is, were the Nuremberg race laws derived from or influenced by American race law? And let's go to the next slide. Okay. There is no question that the law on the protection of German blood and German honor, the law, as you may recall, that criminalized interracial marriage, is derived directly from American race law. While many other countries prohibited interracial marriage, the United States was the only country in the world that criminalized it. And the proverbial smoking gun is that transcript of the June 5th, 1934 meeting. The transcript reveals that the Nazi radicals pushed for the criminalization of interracial marriage, specifically based upon the American legal precedent. So there, the trail is very direct, the American legal precedent. The Reich citizenship law cannot be directly traced to a specific American legal precedent, but that does not preclude the possibility of influence. What am I saying? Nazi lawyers and high officials were very aware that the United States, in order to protect majority rule, had long employed a racial approach to who gets to be a citizen and who gets to vote. Prominent Nazi lawyers wrote articles and books that detailed how 1930s America continued to deny citizenship status to Native Americans, Filipinos, and Puerto Ricans. In the 1930s, none of these groups were allowed to be citizens of the United States, even if born here. And to deprive all of them, as well as Mexicans, Chinese, and Blacks, despite their specific constitutional protections, of their voting rights. For this reason, I believe it is possible that the law on Reich citizenship was indirectly influenced by American citizenship and voting rights law. In other words, the American example that America also used a racial approach to find a way to stop people, to deprive people of citizenship and all voting right and their right to vote. This was in the air. This was in the ether. So it is possible. At the very least, I suspect that Nazi leadership may have derived validation from American race law that they were pursuing the correct course to guarantee that all political power would stay in the hands of Aryan Germans. Now that we have addressed the specific historical connections between the Nuremberg race laws and American race law, another question flows from that. Well, what about more broadly? Not just the Nuremberg laws, but did American racial policies more broadly influence Hitler and the Nazi leadership? Next slide. In Hitler's American model, the United States in the making of Nazi race law, Professor Whitman pushed back against prior scholarship that concluded there was, of course, no direct American influence on Nazi race law, or at least no meaningful influence. To the contrary, Whitman argued, quote, the sources, read soberly, point a different picture. Awful it may be to contemplate, but the reality is that the Nazis took a sustained, significant, and sometimes even eager interest in the American example in race law. Determining the nature and extent of cross-cultural influence, meaning defining the term, what do we mean by influence, is a highly complicated and controversial affair. Holocaust and legal scholars will continue to debate this question between Whitman's view and those scholars, he's maximal and other scholars are minimal. That said, we certainly know two broad facts as lay people. What are the facts? One, from all these Nazi documents, from the 1933 Prussian Memorandum, the National Socialist Handbook for Law and Legislation, and the transcript of that meeting, we know that Nazi lawyers and officials extensively studied, analyzed, and debated the possible applications of Jim Crow segregation and American race laws to the construction of the Nazi racial state. Is that influence? Is that direct? Is that indirect? That's something for each of us to think about and for scholars to debate. But it's a fact that that is what they did. They analyzed, debated, and they studied. And number two, Hitler praised the United States for the racial restrictions underpinning American immigration policy, the mass murder of Native Americans, and the racist theories of the American eugenics movement. This we need to spend a little more moment on in detail. Next slide. On immigration policy, Hitler singled out the 1924 Immigration Act because it excluded so-called undesirable races. In Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote, "The American Union categorically refuses the immigration of physically unhealthy elements and simply excludes the immigration of certain races." Let me pause, I digress for 1 minute. I don't know how many of us really knew this. I certainly was not taught this myself in US history. The 1924 Immigration Act restricted immigration to the United States by imposing quotas of national origin determined by the country's deemed racial superiority or inferiority. In plain language, the law rigged the national immigration system to favor Northern and Western Europeans, Nordics, to exclude most Asians, and to disfavor Eastern and Southern Europeans. And by the way, who are Eastern and Southern Europeans? Jews. Hitler also spoke glowingly about America's mass murder of Native Americans and westward territorial expansion. In a 1928 speech, now Hitler's not in power yet, he praised America for having, quote, gunned down the millions of Redskins to a few 100,000 and now keep the modest remnant under observation in a cage. In other words, on reservations. In the early 1940s, Nazi leaders defended Germany's brutal conquest of countries to the east, Poland and other countries, by comparing America's westward expansion to Germany's quest for Lebensraum, living space. Finally, Hitler applauded the racist theories of the American eugenics movement that called for the exclusion of so-called genetically inferior races from immigration to the United States, and also advocated for the compulsory sterilization of the mentally and physically disabled, including minorities deemed genetically unfit to reproduce. I want to emphasize, I'm not talking at the moment about the German eugenics movement. I'm talking about the American eugenics movement. Hitler knew of the two most famous American eugenicists, Lothrop Stoddard and Madison Grant. Stoddard was accorded a private audience with Hitler in 1939. Hitler wrote a personal note to Grant saying that his 1916 book, The Passing of the Great Race, was, quote, my Bible. Next slide. I have to take a moment here to point out that the racist theories of the American eugenics movement were enormously influential in setting American policies in the early 20th century. And as I said before, American eugenics movement caused enormous harm and hurt. American eugenics is reflected in the 1921 Emergency Quota Act and the 1924 Immigration Act that seriously limited the immigration of undesirable races to the United States. American eugenics is also reflected in the 32 states that legislated compulsory sterilization programs between 1907 and 1937 and forcibly sterilized more than 60,000 institutionalized Americans. People were sterilized against their will, not just in Germany, but here in the United States. I was never taught this. Finally, let's briefly discuss how Hitler and the Nazi regime perceived the United States. On the one hand, Hitler and the Nazi regime could not comprehend American principles of human equality, equal rights, due process under law, the prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. These august principles are totally American. They really are. And they were anathema to the Nazis. On the other hand, Hitler and prominent Nazi lawyers and high officials perceived Germany and the United States as kindred spirits. Side by side with the grand constitutional tradition, they saw America's preoccupation with race. Nazi lawyers saw the contradiction between the American principles of human equality and equal rights under law, equal justice under law, and the American reality of Jim Crow segregation and the unequal treatment accorded America's minority populations as proof. The contradiction was proof of America's determination, America's own determination to ensure racial purity and majority rule. In 1936, the German press agency wrote, for us Germans, it is especially important to know and see how one of the biggest states in the world with Nordic stock already has race legislation, which is quite comparable to that of the German Reich. In Hitler's view, the United States and Germany were both Nordic countries that pursued the racial policies necessary to preserve its Nordic roots and to protect the racial purity and superiority of the nation. And with that, I will conclude. I want to thank you for your kind attention, and I'd be happy to hear your comments, reflections, and answer any questions that I can, any further questions that I can.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. It may be a tiny bit off topic, but what I was wondering is why do you feel that it was okay or sanctioned that plantation owners would have relations with their slaves? And that was not something that was written into law, that you could not do that. And it was, and yet then there became the race laws. Was it that they were looked at the slaves as property, that they were going to be bringing in people to become future slaves? It just seemed confusing to me why there was that was permitted, and then later on.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I haven't studied enough to give you a definitive answer, but my first answer would be that the view of Jim Crow racism is that coming out of the legacy of slavery is that Black people are property.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
They're not human beings. They're not human beings.
Mhm.
They're property, and they are property to be used and exploited. And that's okay.
That's what I was going to say, Lynn, that they were property. You could do whatever you want with them.
I have a question regarding the Emergency Quota Act.
Thank you.
Am I jumping ahead of anybody?
No, go ahead. We'll take as many questions that I want to.
24, the USS St. Louis rejection.
Yes.
I'm not sure of the exact year, but I'm guessing it was around 1940. Is there a relationship between the two? Was that the justification of the rejection, or were there other reasons?
The rejection of these, thank you for pointing it out, Howard. The rejection of the St. Louis, it was right here. It was right on our border. They were so close. But Roosevelt and the Congress and the State Department refused to let them in. They were afraid of push. It was an anti-Semitic thing, and they were afraid of pushback. That they were going to allow in Jews, and it's all based, as we say, on all this racial stuff that we've talked about. In other words, it's more than anti-Semitism, I think, is what I'm trying to say to everybody. These racial doctrines are about racial purity. They're about this sense of your racial enemy is a threat to you, to your survival, to your survival as a race. And these were very powerful in American life. They still are.
I just wonder whether the act was used as the justification, or was there no?
What was that, Howard?
Listed. I mean, did they say why?
Specifically why? No, they requested, I would think it was really public pressure. You know, there was a bill, I believe it was called the Rogers Bill, that was proposed, as we said, from the 1924 law. The amount of Jews that were allowed into the country as refugee was very small. there was a proposal, okay, and then there was the Evian conference, and United States would not accept Jews, would not take in any Jews. There was a proposal, legislation, I believe it was called the Rogers legislation, that let's just take in some Jewish children, 10,000 Jewish refugee children. It couldn't get through the Congress. Because the Congress, the public, 1930s America was very anti-Semitic for all these reasons, which we've now talked about in terms of the racist racial ideology. And even bringing in children could not get past the Congress. Other questions?
Rabbi, kind of a question, comment, more for consideration than answering. Back in the early 1970s, I took a sociology course that had a guest professor from, I believe it was Yale University. If I could remember her name, I would give it to you. But she put forth a theory that within everybody's, she didn't use DNA at that time, but basically within anybody's DNA, we go back to our tribal instincts of survival, which is basically my tribe is better than your tribe. Therefore, I want nothing to do with your tribe, and your tribe is an enemy if you in any act interferes with what I want. And basically, it was up to civilization to overcome these traits of survival. And, not that I'm justifying what took place, because there really is no justification for it, but it is up to civilization to overcome those traits. And what I think you can see in the laws that were passed there was the failure of civilization to overcome those traits, but to legislate those traits into law.
Right. We took racial ideas and attitudes and enshrined them in law.
Rabbi,
Which makes it even harder. Yeah.
We're still doing it.
Yeah, let's just
Rabbi?
go around. I see Barbara Chesler, and then I see Barbara Guilford and Beverly. No, I think it's Mary. Go ahead.
and Ruth Borshak too.
Rabbi, how can you tie this back to critical race theory? I think that, we know who it is that doesn't want critical race theory taught in the schools. And to me, a lot of that are the people who are very, very racist. So to me, it's like a fear that they don't want the truth to be told. They don't want people to hear, you many times today said, I was never taught this.
Yes.
It's still not being taught. And
Right.
it's not going to be taught because they don't want the truth to be told.
Right. I think it's
Have you tied the two together at all?
next lecture.
I think you need to put all of this in a book, Rabbi. I really do.
Yeah, I mean, they're obviously related, and I think to put the nicest view on it, I think there is a sense among some, there's a sense of denial, sense of amnesia about American history, but I think some of it is also political, that there are the quarters of our country that don't want the story to be told, that don't want these truths to be told. Why? Well, given what we've talked about now, I would put in the language of it endangers the race. It endangers the majority rule of the race. It endangers the control of the race. If we talk about bad things that the race did.
So I have a question.
That's endangerment.
So if that's the case, then what you're saying is the fertilization of these kinds of aggressive responses is fear-based. It exists and it takes root when the majority of people are vulnerable to fear-mongering.
Yes, yes, indoctrination and fear. This is, I think, a very important thing, Marna, that comes out of this conversation. And that's why I think that fourth principle, in other words, I don't believe that that hating another people or dehumanizing another people or thinking you're superior to other people, I don't think that in and of itself necessitates genocide or necessitates what we saw Jim Crow too. I think what really brings out the worst in people is that when they are indoctrinated to believe that the other is a threat to you, a threat.
So that's when they're vulnerable to lies.
That's when, yeah, and that's when they're vulnerable to lies, and that's when they're vulnerable to do terrible things. That's when they accuse, you know, white Christian going people accuse blacks of being savage, and then it is the white Christians who savagely torture black people to death. How do we understand that? How do we explain that? It's not just prejudice. Prejudice isn't enough. People have to be indoctrinated to believe that they should be afraid. The black person is someone to be feared, and therefore people do terrible things.
Then it becomes systemic.
Yes. Yeah.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I think
Let's go
one of
around.
the-
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things
Totally.
that I find most upsetting, that this all goes back to biblical times. We as humanity have learned nothing. We think some people think they're better than other people.
Yeah.
It goes back to Joshua going into Canaan. And we've learned nothing. And that I find the most upsetting of all of this.
It is upsetting. It is upsetting. But we have to continue to fight. I mean, let's come back to the notion of, if all that, this is true, America does have some amazing principles, and it's a fight to sustain them, to achieve them.
Absolutely.
It's a fight to achieve them. But the fact that we do have these beliefs in human equality and prohibit unusual and harsh punishment and due process under law, these things are great. It's just a question of living up to them. And it's a question of recognizing that even in America that formulated these things, even America is not immune.
We're not.
To the belief in a master race. Even America is not immune in doing things, bad things, in the name of racial purity.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, let's keep going. Barbara Guilford and then Bernice.
Where in the early and mid 1930s in Germany were the voices of the clergy, of the intellectuals, of the people in, it's a very educated society in Germany. Were there voices opposing this?
Great question. I've not studied it at length. The answer is yes, there were some. Most were complicit. Most used the Christian faith to defend and excuse Nazism, as did the church in America with Jim Crow.
Yeah.
There is, that is a whole issue of how, how Christianity failed Black Christians. And this whole notion of Christianity, Jesus must be white, is seen as that the church was an accomplice in Jim Crow. And we know this is true. I can't get into all titles, but they used the Bible, they used Christianity to justify Jim Crow racism. And there were some who spoke out against it, but all the force was the church's complicity. Other people who I've not, Bernice, I see a hand
Yeah,
raised.
I just want to say, I was in South Africa a couple of years ago, and I went to the Apartheid Museum, which is very, very well done in the Johannesburg area. And they said that the people that established the apartheid just went and they looked to see what the Nazis did, and that's what they did. And they used the same tests. And, you know, that they had tests for, are you Jewish? You know, if your hair is curly like me, and you can put a pencil in it and it doesn't shake out, then you're a Negro, you know, that kind of stuff. And they had these rules that you have up, and then they had the rules that the apartheid was, and it was 1 for 1, just about.
Yeah.
So it's easy for people to learn. They have the rules.
Easy people to learn.
If they want to do segregation,
Yes.
then they don't have to invent it. They can just
Right.
read history.
Yes. Andy, I see
So
you.
one of the things you said was in Nazi Germany, aside from the idea of racial purity and master race, what there's these conspiracy things that the Jews were doing, whatever, undermining World War I, was the same thing. I can't think of, was the same thing true in American experience with the blacks and African Americans? Did they feel the same thing, that they were doing something to undermine? I wonder, that they were doing something in a conspiratorial way. I haven't come across that.
Yes, I mean, I haven't come across it in great length, but I did read about this, that in the 1930s, it was commonly believed, widely believed, that Black Americans were going to rise up in revolt against the white world and take over America. The Black Americans were going to destroy white culture, white society, white everything, and this apparently was widely believed, as was in Germany this notion of Jews as master conspirators against Germany.
That still exists. Jews take over the world.
Right. Everything we've talked about is still there.
Right.
Still out there.
Still out there. Jews will not replace us. Yeah.
Rabbi, what do the historians say about Hitler's lover, Eva Braun, being Jewish?
Same question.
Great question. I don't know a thing about it. I'd have to look that one up. That one I didn't get to.
It's good to see you. Thank you so much for today.
Oh,
Rabbi?
Barbara Guilford, I think you had a question, and then we'll get to as many more as we can. And then then I wanted to spend a minute on takeaways, what you take away from this. Yeah, Barbara. Barbara, you're muted.
You answered my question before. I move on to the next person.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Who else has a question? Bonnie?
Hi, Rabbi. We're so glad to have you back here speaking with us.
Thank you.
I recently read a really excellent and inspiring book, The Sun Does Rise. And it's about, it's a true story about a Black man that spent 30 years on death row waiting to be killed, and he was innocent. And it's quite an inspiring book, and just so apropos of the discussion today and the extreme racism that he went through. Yes. And was ultimately convicted and put away, and he was completely innocent.
Yes, and we all see where it comes from. What you're saying is so true, and what it reminds me of is one book I read by Leon Litwack, who, by the way, is a great historian of a Black experience in America, and there were several vignettes there of what it was like for Black African-American soldiers back in the United States not to be able to eat in the same place that Nazi POWs were eating. These things are documented too. And that's the way it was. I mean, can we talk, if we talk about racist ideology, that's racist ideology. that even an African-American soldier who has served, defended American freedom, cannot sit at the same table with white soldiers who are American soldiers who are also dining nicely with white German POWs. What could be a more devastating example of what we mean by racist ideology? Okay, I think what I'd like to do, since I don't see, is there any other question that I'm not seeing? I'd like us to spend a minute, and I'm sorry to take so much time. Of course, I'm always the one who thinks that it takes less time to cover this, but I hope it was worthwhile. I'd like us to spend a minute on reflections, a minute on your takeaway. What have you learned today that is for you your most important takeaway? Any volunteers? Yes, Howard.
As difficult as it was, at least in this country, in the late 1800s, and especially maybe the mid or early to mid 1900s, we've come a long way. I think as a country, there are certainly problems today, and we can point to a lot of cases where this does not hold true. But when you look at X number of congressmen and people at the helm, I think we've really come a long way, and a lot of Jewish people rising to the top. So I look at that as a positive. I don't see it going downhill, but compared to where we've been, I think it's terrific.
Good, good, thank you. Other takeaways?
Yeah, I just read, hi, it's Ruth.
Hi, Ruth.
I just read today an article from last week's newspaper about the 1,700 members of the US government starting from day one who were all slaveholders, and how some of them voted generally for all laws that would prevent people from Black or any mixed race rising to the level of those of us who are so pure and wonderful. And my biggest takeaway from today was the fact that I never really understood the parallels between the 30s in the United States and the 30s in Germany. I remember hearing my parents doing a lot of talking about it, but I just never really fully understood it until today. And I thank you very much for bringing all this up to us.
Thank you, Ruth. Yes, Lynn, take
Yes,
away.
I mean, I agree with Ruth in terms of the parallels. For me, I learned a lot about that, but being in the field of special education, what really struck me was the parallels in eugenics.
Yes.
No idea. And then again, to speak to what the gentleman before said, we have come a long way in how our country now views people with, you can't even say the word, with differing abilities. It's not even, you know, that's a positive to come away with too.
Yes, quite right. Andy.
Okay, just continuing on the same topic, it's not even just the parallels, but I never realized the connection, direct or indirect, of the American original sin, you know, those words of Jim Crow that made it into the Nazi laws and justification. I had no idea that was the case. And I think that something very sobering to understand how what we do can influence a lot of the rest of the world.
Absolutely, quite right. Okay, I think I've exhausted everyone. But I hope that it was worthwhile. I hope you learned something very important to you. I really just want to thank you. I want to thank you for coming to hear what I had to share, for sticking in with some very difficult stuff. You see now why I reserved any and all jokes I said for the beginning and not during, because you just can't, you just can't laugh during some of this stuff. And I just want everyone to stay well, stay healthy, and wishing everybody a very good 2022.
You too. Thank you
You
so
too.
much.
Thank you,
Same to you.
Rabbi.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Very
much,
good.
Rabbi.
Thank you. Shalom.
Thank you.
Shalom.
Thank you.
Stay healthy.
Yes.
Bye-bye.